So what we are focusing on is your very current work, and I gather it's also the title of that new book that's going to be published. That is Russian Homophobia, from Stalin to Sochi, Histories and Context. So Dan, we are so much looking forward to this presentation. Hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in this prestigious seminar, and also welcome to Annie and Shafak. I think it's wonderful that this program brings young feminist scholars from Eurasia to come and spend a year in Oxford and enjoy the benefits of being here and meeting people. So welcome to our community. This is, as Maria says, drawn from this book project. And there's the cover. It is already up on Amazon. Apparently Bloomsbury is very eager. But and I'm sorry, the typeface is so small you can't see all the chapter titles, but it's a book that I have been, I would say, nudged into producing. I really wanted to work on medicine in the Gulag camps, and then Putin got re-elected president of Russia in 2012, and in 2013 he sort of weaponized homophobia as a political tool, and people started to ask me to write things about this or to give talks about this. And in my first year at Oxford, actually, 2013-14, I think I wrote 5 talks in 1 year while I was teaching and doing all the other crazy stuff, trying to understand where everything was and what it was. So I decided that there was enough material in the desk drawer to actually pull together a book, and this is the result. So it will be out in August. It's divided into 3 sections. In the introduction, which I'm going to give you a taster of today, I talk about 2013, Russia's year of homophobia, the year when the gay propaganda law was introduced. And then the 3 sections look in rough chronological order at, first of all, homophobic persecution in Soviet Russia after 1945. So looking at Gulag sexualities, at masculinity and homosexuality in a small micro study, and also at the diary of a Soviet singing superstar, Vadim Kozin, for 1955-56. He had been sent to the Gulag for his homosexuality, and he was about 5 years out of the Gulag by then, and he was touring in Siberia as a singer at that time. So we now have the diary of that time period, and it's fascinating reading. The second part looks at queer visibility and the rise of this concept of traditional sexual relations. So it's looking at various aspects of the increasing visibility of queer people in Soviet Russia and post-Soviet Russia in the late Soviet period and the 1990s. And then finally, the final chapter is more in the realm of historiography and cultural studies, where I talk about the way that homosexuality is discussed today in Russia. I talk about writing and remembering Russia's queer past in these chapters. So we look at the barriers, the obstacles to getting more information about the persecution of homosexuals under Stalin. For historians today, I look at the way that biography remains heteronormative in voice in Russian biography today, even when the subject is queer. And then I look at the problems of applying the lessons of queer theory to the Russian case, because Russia is not quite Europe, but it is Europe. And we run into problems when we begin to map queer theory onto the Russian case. So let's move straight into this talk. Late in the night of May the 9th, 2013, in the central Russian city of Volgograd, a 23-year-old electrician, Vladislav Tornovoy, met a pair of friends not far from his home. One was Alexander Burkov, 22, a neighbor and classmate on Tornovoy's electrical engineering course. The other was a friend of Burkov's, Anton Smolin, 27, a graduate of the same course, but someone who's only recently out of prison. He'd been sent there for theft. They bought beer and sat down to drink it in a kid's playground in the courtyard of the apartment block where Burkov and Tornovoy lived. Now, what happened next is difficult to establish. Tornovoy did not come home, and the next morning, his body was discovered in the courtyard, sexually mutilated. His two friends were quickly arrested, and Smolin's supposed motive for the attack was revealed by a police investigator. While they were drinking, they said that Tornovoy admitted that he was gay, and Smolin claimed their outrage at his non-traditional orientation triggered the attack. So the two assailants got long sentences, about 20 years each, for the murder, but judges refused to consider it a homophobic hate crime. There's no recognition of homophobic hate in Soviet legal, in Soviet legislation. The anti-gay hatred that spurred Vladislav Tornovoy's murder ignited national and global attention. The reason was plain. Russia was then in the throes of a national conversation about the status of its lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender citizens. The talking point of this debate was a bill that had been given first reading in the Duma, the lower house of Russia's parliament, in January 2013. The bill that would ban propaganda for homosexualism, lesbianism, bisexuality, transgender. That was the original rubric among minors. The conversation was far from civil. It was marked by homophobic hate speech, threats of abuse, and actual kidnappings of and violence against men thought to be gay. Against the backdrop of these brutal assaults on fellow citizens, the numerous firings of gay and lesbian teachers, media personalities, and others who dared to speak out against the law and in favor of LGBT rights went almost unreported. Now, Vladislav Tornovoy's murder encapsulated many responses to homosexuality that convulsed Russia during 2013. The ruling United Russia Party had been stoking anxiety about LGBT rights and lifestyles from the launch of Vladimir Putin's campaign to return to the presidency in late 2011, culminating in his election in May 2012. The campaign of political homophobia sought to revitalize Putin's popularity before the election, but in the election's aftermath, the campaign actually intensified, aiming to remasculinize the presidency after the limp incumbency of his tandem partner in the presidency, Dmitry Medvedev, and mark out Russian distinctiveness in gender, family, and demographic politics. Putin's political homophobia campaign was launched for domestic consumption, but it soon acquired an international dimension as well. In this paper, I look at the nature of homophobia in historical perspective, and then turn to analyze the historical legacy of homophobia dating from the Stalin era. I then examine the evolution of the recent gay propaganda legislation in Russia and the ways that President Putin has presented the law to the world in the run-up to the Sochi Olympics. So first turning to look at a short history of homophobia. Well, homophobia, a word we use all the time now and take for granted, is an American word, invented in a very particular American historical moment. That moment was the explosion of the Stonewall riot and gay liberation in New York City in 1969. The idea of homophobia crystallized in the early 1970s as US gay liberation activists and psychologists, who were activists as well, attempted to explain the psychological and social origins of hostility to homosexuality. Later investigations in Western activism and academic scholarship looked at homophobia through the lenses of lesbian and gay studies, feminism, and queer theory. Between the 1970s and 1990s, new terms were proposed to refine the concept. Theorists spoke of lesbophobia, arguing that homophobia erased women. They proposed terms like heterosexism, heterocentrism, and heteronormativity to focus attention on the dominance of heterosexual prejudice, privilege, and norm setting. The theoretical debate continues, of course. Academic criticism did not submerge the power of the concept of homophobia as a useful word in the West, and later beyond the West. Over the decades after Stonewall, homophobia became a commonplace handle widely used in Western journalism, politics, and everyday speech by the 1990s. From that position, at the dawn of the digital era, it has diffused rapidly as a descriptor of anti-LGBT prejudice around the globe. Global diffusion has not been unproblematic. Finger-pointing at neighbors' homophobia and chauvinistic boasting about eradicating it at home have come under attack as homonationalism, a form of chest-thumping self-congratulation that is less concerned with extending LGBT rights and much more to do with stoking international rivalries. Post-colonial entanglements also cloud how accusations of homophobia are read between former metropole and colony, with the British Commonwealth supplying some of the most acute examples in its relations with Africa and elsewhere. In the 21st century, rapid and transnational diffusion of homophobia as a political concept has obscured some of the historical and intellectual baggage that it acquired as it evolved in the West. That historical baggage haunts the use of the word and contributes to misunderstanding in transnational dialogues about anti-LGBT policies and laws. The imprint of European fascism, and specifically German Nazism, is a critical component that haunts Western assumptions about homophobia. The work of Dagmar Herzog, who will be coming to speak in the history faculty the 10th of February, I just put a plug there for the history faculty's LGBT History Month workshop. Dagmar Herzog, her work has demonstrated how integral homophobic discourse and aggressively heteronormative policies were to Nazi ideologists. Herzog has also argued forcefully for the powerful impact of memory of the Nazi past in the shaping of post-1945 European sexualities, and that includes liberalizing attitudes towards homosexual rights. In West Germany and elsewhere, anti-fascist political arguments underpinned the 1960s repeal of laws making homosexuality a crime. The liberalization of European sexual regulation accelerated in the 1980s under the influence of interpretations of international human rights law that foregrounded rights to a private life protected from state intrusion. Moreover, LGBT campaigning effectively mobilized memory of the Nazi experience in Europe to win the argument for sexual rights. A politics of commemoration of gay and lesbian suffering served to popularize sympathy for contemporary rights struggles. In the West, gay and lesbian activists invoked the Holocaust as a homosexual catastrophe in historical writing, in campaigns, and in outward-directed polemics with mainstream media and wider society. Activists appropriated the pink triangle, the symbol assigned to male homosexuals in Nazi concentration camps, and wore it as a link between contemporary homophobia, including AIDS-related prejudice, and the murderous violence directed at queer men and women under fascism. The commemoration of homosexual victims of fascist violence gained official approval and became more commonplace in the late 1980s and 1990s in museums and concentration camp memorials in Europe and at the Holocaust Memorial Museum established in Washington, D.C. Eventually, fascist homophobia became a standard feature of Western school curricula and joined the list of Nazi human rights violations cited in canonical accounts of the history of 20th century Europe. A form of prejudice that scarcely had a name before 1969. In the Western imagination, homophobia has become a marker of the authoritarian mindset, tied to political machismo and violence, and after its apogee under the Nazi regime, associated as well with genocide. The burden of historical memory that haunts Western notions of homophobia calls for sensitivity when applying the word to cultures and contexts where histories are different or have been processed differently. We're obliged to criticize homophobia when we see it, but we must do so reflectively, remembering that homophobic violence at home took decades to recognize. We must also take into account the entanglements of homo-nationalist rivalries and post-colonial relationships. Such care was seldom taken when Western journalism and social media attacked Russia's policies in 2013-14. Accusations of homophobia cast at Russia proceeded from a cluster of contradictory and memoryless assumptions about Russia's place in Europe and the world. We cannot decide if Russia is a part of Europe or a distinctive civilization of its own, and the forgotten battles over that ambiguity cloud our reactions. In our amnesia, we also struggle with the idea that a country so much like us might take as long as we did or longer to get to grips with ubiquitous social and political homophobia. Masha Gessen was surely right to point out in 2013 that we were particularly disturbed by Russian homophobia because Russians are white, as she put it, and their homophobes could be stylish and fluent. But also because Russia in 2013 presented what she called the spectacle of history shifting abruptly into reverse. In the US and Europe, until the arrival of President-elect Trump on the scene, a phrase I've just had to insert here, we have experienced an unbroken curve of progress in the construction of full LGBT citizenship. Yet, as Weimar Germany's history shows, LGBT progress is not automatic, but can be arrested when political tectonic plates shift. Moreover, the memoryless accusations of homophobia betray an expectation that we know best how to get to a better place. At the risk of stating the obvious, there is no single correct path to a post-homophobic society and polity, and there is no common starting point in an equally homophobic dark age. The rights debates about LGBT people in the new accession states of the European Union over the past decade demonstrate that the path to tolerance is not found on a technocrat's roadmap alone, but it's built in a subtle blend of cultural, social, and political exchanges. What is more, the ultimate design of full LGBT citizenship in the European Union is not found in any charter or policy document. It is instead evolving patchwork style as Europe's different societies with their different religious, cultural, and historical characters explore what tolerance might look like at home. In other words, that's how we're doing post-homophobic politics in the EU at the moment. So turning to look at political homophobia in Russian history, and this is some trash I found on the internet. I didn't have a very good illustration for this. Political scientists have recently produced new work on the uses of homophobia as a political tool. In the process, they've developed more conceptually sophisticated frames for understanding contemporary outbursts of hostility to the threat of the sex and gender dissident. Students of political homophobia have largely been motivated by the rise of vigorous anti-LGBT movements in Africa and Asia, but also by the continuing activities of well-organized homophobic political forces in Europe and North America. Comparative and transnational perspectives allow us to see when and how state actors and elites choose to build a homophobic project, and what transnational influence peddling offers local leaders in terms of ideas and funding. The political trigger for most modern political homophobia campaigns is an economic or national security crisis threatening the state's stability. Such homophobic projects presume a backdrop of genuine or imitation democratic politics with elections and other forms of popular mobilization. At stake is usually a contest over national identity construction, in which the nation is said to be under threat from an external, often Western and previously colonial, ideology of gender and sexual difference. Local traditions of kinship, marriage, and gender relations are recast as timeless patterns, often presented as suffering under the pressure from neoliberal globalization, digital technologies, and social change. Elites deploying a project of political homophobia offer the solution of a stronger national community, forged around traditional and explicitly anti-LGBT values, frequently backed by religious teaching. They raise the specter of a dangerous LGBT minority said to be in the grips of Western or colonial influence. The irony of their message is that significant parts of it are Western in origin. Whether it's the inspiration from US and European Christian churches or the nationalism they propound. The payoff for homophobe politicians is political legitimation, electorates distracted from intractable economic and social problems, and stronger allies among churches and other civil society institutions. Virtually all of these features apply to Russia's Year of Homophobia, 2013, that I'll discuss later in this paper. Now, historians, I've found, have been less engaged with studying homophobia in the past. At least, they've not produced similarly comparative and analytical studies. Historical work is not seriously engaged with the concept of homophobia, and historians have generally preferred queer theory produced terms like heteronormativity that describe everyday contexts rather than moments of violence and crisis. That seems to have been our practice so far. Some historical background about the treatment of homosexuality and gender dissent in Russia can help to explain how Putin's homophobic project of 2013 got the traction it did. Russia's imperial past, its relationship to Europe, and to the force of modern nationalism, its religious heritage, and the tempestuous politics of its 20th century, all of these things shaped the frameworks that the country produced for managing queer sexuality and genders. And I don't have time to go into all of that, but I'm very happy to discuss it in the Q&A. One of the recurring features of this history, by the way, that I'm grappling with, is that we have huge gaps in our research base. There's lots of things we don't know about Russian queer sexualities and their regulation, something I explore in the book, by the way. From 1917, Vladimir Lenin's communists used gender politics as a political battering ram to disrupt the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church. That church was arguably the new Soviet government's most dangerous opponent. If family life and sexuality had been largely regulated by religious authority before 1917, now they were aggressively desacralized in what is regarded as Russia's first sexual revolution. Western European socialist ideas of the end of patriarchal male domination, of free love, and life governed by science, born in the socialist parties of urban Germany and France, and extensively discussed by 19th century Russian radicals, were seized by Russian Marxists, and they were imposed on the population of Soviet Russia, 80% of which consisted of subsistence peasants suspicious of city life. Almost immediately in 1917 and 1918, marriage was secularized, divorce radically liberalized, and women's legal status in the family and public life equalized with that of men. Bolshevik secular and scientific values also led to the legalization of abortion in 1920 and the decriminalization of sodomy in 1922. Now, the Soviet return to a ban on sodomy in 1933-34 was proposed by the security police and backed with relish by Stalin and his Politburo. the leaders in the Communist Party. Stalin personally edited the new article for the Criminal Code. This was the moment when the Soviet state adopted a modern anti-homosexual politics, the birth of modern Russian political homophobia. The context was a profound social and economic crisis. My students know about this, I think, the ones in the room, caused by the Stalin ruling group's policies of forced collectivization of agriculture and force-paced five-year plan industrialization. And I can speak more about that crisis if you're curious. With the new anti-sodomy law, surveillance of male homosexual activity and networks became a routine part of security and regular police work. Intriguingly, police did not view lesbians as a security threat to the same degree, and there was no law against lesbianism. It appears that enforcement of the law against sodomy ebbed and flowed as the police reacted to a succession of campaigns directed from the Politburo against various enemies of the state. In the period from the Great Terror of 1937-38 to the death of Stalin in 1953, the accessible archival record is almost silent about the number of arrests and the ways in which male homosexuals were handled by the police and the penal system. And there's much more research that needs doing on that. In the West, the onset of the Cold War in the late 1940s and early 1950s unleashed a renewed police and political scrutiny on male homosexuals as security risks. Whether similar concerns were raised by Soviet security forces after 1945 remains still unknown. With the death of Stalin in 1953 and the reform of ideology and reduction of political terror, a period of liberalization, the so-called thaw, opened. Soviet jurists reviewed Stalin's laws to cancel them or reform them. However, in 1958, the anti-sodomy law was confirmed and renewed. Soviet experts also showed a new interest in psychiatric treatment for lesbianism. We don't know why these decisions were made. The archives remain closed or inaccessible for other reasons, and I can speak about that in the Q&A. Nevertheless, a new sense of a right to privacy was asserted by the Soviet people after Stalin's death, and this included some gay men and lesbians. The 1960s to 1980s saw a second Soviet sexual revolution that was not about political policy, as the first one had been in 1917, but more evident in social change and lifestyles. The majority of Soviet citizens now lived in cities and had better housing. Heterosexual activity before marriage was on the increase. Marriage was crumbling as a lifelong institution, and divorce was rising sharply. The family was shrinking and appeared in need of fresh measures of support. Political stagnation, however, blocked public debate and decisive policymaking to shape this spontaneous sexual revolution from below in the late Soviet decades. During the same years, significant change in the lives of Soviet homosexual men and women emerged. In the book, I examine the rise of a more visible male homosexual subculture in Soviet public space. More research remains to be done on this period of dynamism under the ice of stagnation, including more research on the hostility that an increasingly visible lesbian and gay population experienced in Soviet society. Interviews with older gay men and lesbians have revealed that popular incomprehension of and contempt for sexual nonconformity pervaded the Soviet family and workplace. And here I'm referring to the work of Francesca Stella on Soviet and post-Soviet lesbians, and forthcoming work by the doctoral student Artur Klesch in Paris, who's interviewed large numbers of older gay men and lesbians. It should be emphasized that in the late 1980s, on the eve of the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russian queer men and women were not merely victims of widespread homophobia. More and more, they were aware of the rise of a Western gay liberation movement. They were aware of lesbian feminism and AIDS and HIV activism. They sought ways to translate these liberating ideas to the Soviet context. The democratization of the late 1980s, Gorbachev's glasnost, enabled spaces for discussion, conferences, festivals, and ultimately face-to-face exchanges and collaboration with Western LGBT and feminist activists. Communist rule and the Soviet Union ended in 1991, and post-Soviet democratization led very rapidly to the repeal of Stalin's anti-sodomy law in May 1993. Now, activism and visibility seem to offer new realms of freedom in the context of Russia's third sexual revolution of the 20th century. This time, a revolution in public speech about sex during the 1990s. At the same time, the economic and political instability of the 1990s shook popular faith in democracy. The exploitative and shocking sexualization of the public sphere became a focus of anger for some. Conservative nationalists began to seek ways to put the genie of sexual revolution back into the bottle. So I want to turn now to look at the run-up to projects of political homophobia. Now, Putin's 2013 homophobic political project arose against a specific economic and political backdrop. The economic crisis of 2008-09 reversed the country's booming growth rates of the early 2000s, the source of Putin's popularity, reversed them drastically. The campaign of political homophobia seemed calculated to distract public anger about declining living standards and rising prices. Sections of the public were also coming out to street demonstrations against the Putin political system of manipulated elections, state-controlled mass media that gave the opposition no airtime, and the corrupt administration provided by his party, United Russia. In 2011, United Russia's electoral base in the regions was weakening significantly. This was evident even before the December 2011 parliamentary elections, which triggered the wave of anti-corruption protest. A relaunch of the Putin system was necessary to bring voters back to the paramount leader in time for his election to a third term as president in May 2012. At the same time, Putin accelerated an existing process of re-clericalization of the state, that is, bringing the Russian Orthodox Church closer to government and directly involving it in shaping social policy and projecting Russia's voice abroad. This assertion of moral sovereignty is part of a wider domestic and international political narrative developed by the Kremlin, United Russia, and the Orthodox Church, condemning feminism and LGBT politics as extremist and foreign, while promoting heterosexual traditional family values as true to Russian nationhood. Now, scholars disagree on how influential the church actually is within the Kremlin and whether the Kremlin is just using the church as another mouthpiece. Conservative nationalists in post-Soviet Russia have been developing anti-LGBT political ideas and proposing laws to give them force since the end of the 1990s, the end of this third sexual revolution. And they were prompted by religious and secular revulsion at this sexual revolution of the 1990s. Now, eager to enact sweeping reform quickly, in a 1993 omnibus bill, then President Boris Yeltsin had repealed Stalin's law against male homosexuality. However, in the wake of decriminalization, novels and films of the 1990s used homosexual themes not to celebrate the liberation of a previously repressed group, but to mark characters and scenarios as taboo, strange, and non-Russian. Many spectators and politicians believed that visible homosexuality was a foreign import, not Russian in origin. These politicians sought to recriminalize gay male sex. In a farcical parliamentary debate in 2002, the Duma considered restoring the Stalin law and also debated the banning of lesbianism and even slapping fines on masturbation. The initiatives failed dismally. Now, from this debacle, Russia's conservative nationalist politicians realized that the return to Stalinist criminal penalties for homosexual acts was impossible. Conservatives found they had to refine their anti-LGBT story. they turned to the problem of LGBT visibility and continued working on their political language, particularly at the level of local government. From 2006, the mayor of Moscow annually refused applications from lawyer and activist Nikolai Alexeyev. This is him up in the top corner there being arrested, for a gay pride march in the capital, condemning the idea as satanic and mobilizing local Orthodox and Muslim leaders to join in the vilification of queer visibility. And I can talk about the gay pride in Moscow in the Q&A. Now, many in Russia thought the battles over pride marches pitted extreme positions against each other in an unsophisticated slanging match with limited political value. Pride on the streets of Moscow seemed to matter more to the Western international media than to domestic queer activists and wider society. And I can talk about the formation of two generations of LGBT activists in Russia, an early generation in the 80s and 1990s that mostly gives up or feels that there's no longer any space for them by the end of the 1990s, and a second generation that arises with the arrival of the digital era in the 2000s, much more middle class and much more focused on the community itself, inward looking as opposed to outward looking by and large. Now, the activities of this second generation were extremely limited and arguably less overtly public thanks to the digital technologies they used. Nevertheless, the fear of queer visibility continued to agitate conservative nationalist politicians. The lack of a vocal, visible, and ubiquitous Russian LGBT movement didn't deter political homophobes seeking to extend their anti-LGBT messages. As David Murray has pointed out for the case of Barbados, the threat of spectral sexuality can be an effective fear-producing bogeyman even in conservative societies where LGBT activism barely exists. In this context, Russia's conservative politicians considered banning gay propaganda among minors or school children. Similar measures originated most notoriously in Margaret Thatcher's Britain in 1988, not repealed in England until 2003, and many were adopted and are still in effect in local and state level in the United States. Russia's regions served as testbeds for variations on the anti-propaganda law, offering conservatives opportunities to craft the language and messages of political homophobia. In 2006, Ryazan province passed an ordinance banning propaganda for homosexualism among minors. This was apparently a local and spontaneous action. A ruling by the Russian Constitutional Court in January 2010 yielded a significant setback for the LGBT community. The court upheld the Ryazan province gay propaganda law, and its decision embedded in Russian jurisprudence the tendentious concepts of traditional versus non-traditional marital relations, terminology that had already been in circulation for some years, but was now in Russian law. In 2010 and especially 2012, regional assemblies around Russia began adopting local versions of the gay propaganda law. Now, was there a direct connection between the Ryazan ordinance and these later ones? Did Putin's Kremlin coordinate this burst of homophobia across the country? Was it a political homophobic project in the sense that Barry Adam proposes? It's impossible to say with any certainty, given that no comparative research on the regional gay propaganda laws exists, and since the Kremlin's decision-making processes have become exceedingly opaque in recent years. President Putin later claimed his government was responding to a genuine public clamor in enacting the national gay propaganda ban. Indeed, from available sources, a varied picture of local initiative and party coordination driving the local laws comes to light. And the geographic spread of the regional ordinances against gay propaganda suggests a resonance with La Russie profonde. So turning to look at the federal gay propaganda ban. and this is entitled From Siberia to Moscow. The regional debates apparently showed the Kremlin that a national ban on gay propaganda would be understood and supported popularly by politicians and the public, and that a national debate on LGBT issues could injure Russia's democratic opposition by challenging its patriotism and its political virility. The rationale for a homophobic campaign by the end of 2012 was related to the protests of urban voters during 2011-2012, that election cycle. You had parliamentary elections and then presidential elections following hard on each other in that winter. Re-elected president in May 2012, Putin responded with selective repression to divide and quell the protest movement. One thrust of this repression targeted a Moscow feminist punk protest band, who needs no introduction here, Pussy Riot, who sang Mother of God Chased Putin Away in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in February 2012. The Pussy Riot affair of 2012 they were arrested and charges of hooliganism motivated by religious hatred were slapped on the Pussy Riot 3. That affair dramatized key themes that foreshadowed the political homophobia campaign of 2013. It presented a spectral threat, feminist gender ideology, which has limited popular purchase in modern Russia, as an existential one for the country's survival. Feminist gender thinking challenged so-called traditional values and the sanctity of the Orthodox Church. It suggested that feminism was foreign to Russia, extremist, and inspired by Western forces that desired a weak Russia. It stirred a loud, negative reaction in the Western media that took on a Russophobic tinge. It concentrated fire on a corner of the opposition movement that was challenging for those Democrats to defend. These messages could be driven home with a fresh campaign to keep the gender issue in the public eye, the specter of gay propaganda supposedly threatening Russia's children. So the call for the gay propaganda law originated from Siberia in a request to the National Duma. In March 2012, the legislature of Novosibirsk province, a seedbed of conservatism, asked the federal parliament for a national ban on propaganda for homosexualism among minors. The Novosibirsk appeal was sponsored by 2 United Russia members, and it's unusual for such petitions to the National Duma from the regions to succeed. And this perhaps is a clue that this was a Kremlin project. In the National Duma, spearheading the promotion of the law fell to Yelena Mizulina of the Kremlin-loyal A Just Russia party. There she is at the podium. Mizulina was the chair of Parliament's Committee on the Family, Women and Children. In January 2013, the draft propaganda law was approved on first reading by 388 votes to 1, with 1 mistaken abstention. You pressed the wrong button, apparently. The draft listed specific sexual and gender orientations to be banned from uncontrolled promotion: homosexualism, lesbianism, bisexualism, transgender. Mizulina conducted discussions behind closed doors that we don't know about on the law through the spring of 2013. By the third reading of this law on the 11th of June, the final version of the bill dropped this list of orientations and replaced it with the catch-all category of non-traditional sexual relations. So propaganda for non-traditional sexual relations among minors was banned. By doing this, the lawmakers shifted the focus from individual identities to sexual acts which had previously been defined in legal judgments as non-traditional. This was done, presumably, to evade charges that the law discriminated against particular people. The change and its timing may indicate that the storm over the murder of Vladislav Tornovoy compelled Mizulina to shed the unambiguously discriminatory list of orientations. She had angrily rejected suggestions that her law was generating anti-gay violence. The concept of traditional sexual relations, incubated in legal discussions and the media, was conclusively embedded in Russian law and in the popular consciousness by this debate. The epithets traditional, non-traditional assert that queerness is novel, alien, and by implication not indigenous, but from abroad. The concept enshrines an old myth of Russia's sexual innocence in the new law. President Putin signed the bill into law at the end of June 2013. So how has this law been used? The impact of the new law was swiftly felt. In contrast to Margaret Thatcher's Section 28, that was never actually used against anyone. There are no known cases of the use of that law. This law was put to immediate use against foreigners first and then Russians. 3 weeks after the enactment of the ban, police arrested and deported Dutch LGBT activists at a youth rights camp in Murmansk. The first arrests of foreign activists, that's a headline, were widely reported and gave the impression that the law was meant to hit outsiders bringing alien values to the nation. Authorities across the country have investigated, charged, and convicted Russian LGBT campaigners, website and book publishers, journalists, teachers, and other citizens for violations of the gay propaganda law. And one Russian activist, lawyer, sociologist, thinks there are now about 2,000 cases on the books. In October 2013, a United Russia politician, Vasily Milonov, raised complaints with prosecutors over a website aimed at helping gay teenagers and children, Дети 404, Children 404 in other words. A long legal battle ensued. Russia's embarrassing Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, lied about the homosexuality of the nation's most famous composer, Pyotr Tchaikovsky, claiming that there was no evidence to prove his homosexuality in a September 2013 debate over a planned film biography. And of course, there are stacks of torridly homoerotic letters in the Tchaikovsky archives, as Alexander Poznansky has demonstrated. This biopic of Tchaikovsky, which is meant to commemorate an anniversary of his birth, was to be subsidized with funds from Medinsky's ministry. I don't think it's actually been made, in fact. Other examples, this bus shelter was judged too colorful by local conservatives, and they wanted it banned under the gay propaganda law. Russia has 89 different provinces and autonomous regions. One of them is a Jewish national region in the far east of Russia, Birobidzhan. It has this flag. It has always had this flag. That flag was brought to experts at the Hermitage for expertise to discuss whether it was gay propaganda or not. These are amusing examples of the consequences of the law. However, violence against gay men and lesbians surged in the wake of the passage of the law. Vigilante groups around the country were already operating under the brands Occupy Pedophilia and Occupy Gerontophilia. More cases of their activity were reported from the summer of 2013, and I present evidence of that in the book. President Putin's personal pronouncements about LGBT rights during 2013 merit attention, especially in the run-up to the Sochi Winter Olympics in February 2014. The president's statements about the question carried particular weight in an information environment that's tightly restricted and that restricts access to the paramount leader. And that is apparently designed to, he apparently intends to project an aura of a confident, paternalistic authority. Putin adopted an avuncular but firm tone, asserting that both Russia was a tolerant nation, while also a country determined to regulate morality according to its own traditions. The president's statements thus conveyed to foreign audiences the key messages to the West and Russia's allies about Russia's independent conservative politics in the wake of its resurgence as a sovereign power. In April 2013, as the debate over Russia's gay propaganda law was in full swing at home and abroad, President Putin made an official visit to the Netherlands as part of what would turn out to be a rocky year of celebrations marking 4 centuries of diplomatic ties between the two countries. In Amsterdam, he encountered a large LGBT demonstration against Russia's political homophobia. During a media conference with the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, journalists quizzed Putin about Russia's treatment of LGBT citizens' rights and about the degree of confrontation his European visits then aroused, Putin's responses began with assertions of tolerance, and this is what he had to say. So that this is all clear and understood. In the Russian Federation, the rights of sexual minorities are not being trampled upon. These people are the very same as all the rest. They enjoy full rights and freedoms. As president of the Russian Federation, I consider it my duty to defend their interests and rights. And I suggest that, like other citizens of Russia, they have no other president but me. In this regard, I want to say that they make their way in their careers prosper, they are rewarded with state prizes, orders and medals, honorific titles, and honorable citations if they deserve them. That is the practice of our political life. I'm certain that it will remain that way. That's the end of the quotation. It is worth pointing out that no leader of Russia in its entire history has ever made such an explicitly positive public statement about the rights of LGBT citizens. Enlightened leaders who decriminalized male homosexuality in the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin in 1922, Boris Yeltsin in 1993, were silent about their reasons for doing so. Liberals, in inverted commas, who relaxed dictatorship such as Nikita Khrushchev were actively homophobic, or, in the case of Mikhail Gorbachev, simply overwhelmed by the tide of events. Now, in a similar vein, Putin sought to strike a similarly even-handed, fatherly tone in the "Was Tchaikovsky gay?" debate of September 2013. In an interview at that point, he said, "They say that Tchaikovsky was a homosexual. Truth be told, we don't love him because of that. But he was a great musician and we all love his music. So what? There's no point in making a mountain out of a molehill. There's nothing wrong here. Nothing wrong is going to happen in our country." Putin's invocation of toleration for the homosexual genius relied on a popular myth of Russian big-heartedness that finds room for eccentricity, if not diversity. The same theme had often been invoked by conservatives as they refined their anti-LGBT rhetoric over the previous 2 decades. From defensive expressions of paternal tolerance, Putin soon shifted to a more aggressive analysis that positioned Russia as defender of traditional and even authentically European values. He would link this stance to foreign policy, attempting to attract allies on the world stage and in particular in the United Nations. He would also begin to link homosexuality to pedophilia, picking up on Mizulina's rhetoric that cultivated fear of the queer as child abuser. In his December 2013 presidential address to the Federal Assembly, an annual State of the Federation speech, Putin commented on the country's distinctive upholding of tradition in the face of what he said were abstract, speculative ideas, contrary to the will of the majority, which does not accept the changes occurring or the proposed revision of values. Putin went on to assert that Russia was defending traditional values, the values of traditional families, in a world where the alternative was a descent into barbarism. Russia would stand for the spiritual and moral basis of civilization, he said, against forces of globalization that crushed local identities and cultures. It was not accidental that this striking passage defining Russia's gender conservatism appeared in the section of his speech devoted to foreign relations strategy, especially vis-a-vis allies and trading partners in the Middle East and Africa. So just turning to Sochi and Russia's statements around Sochi. And then I'll wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah. The approaching Sochi Winter Olympics was a flashpoint that the Kremlin strategists had probably scarcely anticipated when they had apparently given the green light to Mizulina's gay propaganda law in early 2013. From the summer of 2013, calls to Western governments to boycott the Sochi Games began to come from LGBT leaders in the US and UK, including Harvey Fierstein and Stephen Fry, who both recalled the world's indulgence of Nazi Germany's 1936 Berlin Olympics as a form of appeasement. Historically, national boycotts of the Olympics have rarely blunted the prestige of the host nation. But now, in the digital era, the Olympics as an organization, as an industry, has to actually respond to social media protest. National Olympic teams argued successfully against boycotting Sochi, citing the supposed apolitical nature of sport. Yet many Western governments were sympathetic to the issue and spoke about their concerns for LGBT rights in Russia. Coming up against the fellow in the middle here, Vitaly Mutko, Minister of Sport. He said that the gay propaganda law will be scrupulously enforced in Russia, and Putin had to do a certain amount of rowing back because he didn't want an ugly homophobic incident during the games that would mar a project that was so closely associated with his own prestige. But Putin was not about to concede the entire game to Western arguments about human rights. In January 2014, during a carefully stage-managed pre-games interview with national and foreign journalists, Putin reiterated his familiar script, now with deliberate lies that were unlikely to be challenged. Russia was a tolerant nation that does not criminalize homosexuality. That's true. In contrast to over 70 countries that do. The law merely forbade forms of propaganda, not persons of a particular sexual orientation as such. There was no threat of arrest to spectators or visitors at the games. He defended the church's right to call for recriminalization of homosexuality and pointed out that Islam and the Vatican were of one mind on the issue. And he pointed out that the church and the state are separated constitutionally in Russia. Putin went on the attack, linking homosexuality to pedophilia in a duplicitous but obviously deliberate misremembering of the title of the controversial law, which he gave as on the banning of propaganda for pedophilia and homosexualism. His own law. He signed it. He mistitled it in this interview. Nowhere does the word pedophilia appear in this law, and no journalist noticed the president's deception. Putin claimed, again falsely, that other countries, including European ones, are considering legalizing pedophilia, but that the Russian people have their own cultural code, their own traditions, and he cast scorn on Western immigration policy and same-sex family recognition as population policies. Russia would repopulate itself the natural way. Russia's year of political homophobia began with Mizulina's introduction of the gay propaganda law in the Duma, with a justification that pedophilia was tied to adult homosexuality. It ended with the country's president misleading domestic and world audiences about the state of the law in the US and Europe, mocking these societies as incapable of defending Western civilization, and using lies about the spectral threat of pedophilia to justify the persecution of a harmless segment of Russia's population. Naturally, the year of political homophobia did not mark the end of anti-LGBT sentiment in Russia. In fact, during the Olympics, the Russian government passed a new law against adoption of Russian children to countries permitting same-sex marriage. The gathering storm in Ukraine that coincided with the Sochi Olympics nevertheless shifted the world's attention firmly toward the escalating geopolitical crisis. Yet questions about the nature of the homophobic turn in Russia and its origins remain. So just to conclude, what does a longer duration history of Russian homophobia contribute to our understanding of the Putin regime's recent project of political homophobia? Well, the first point is that Putin's project was built on a social base of pre-existing everyday homophobia that was a complex mixture of Stalinist and late Soviet official and popular attitudes. Soviet and post-Soviet popular homophobia requires a lot more research. Russia's first sexual revolution of 1917 degenerated into an extremely tenacious, gendered paternalism, largely impervious to second and third wave Western and local Russian feminism. However much we may blame the Kremlin, Russia's political parties, and its church leaders for their homophobic political project, we have to recognize that these leaders tapped the enthusiasm of a population eager for a scapegoat and already fed plenty of anti-Western, anti-European rhetoric. The gay propaganda law remains popular in Russia today. That will not change with shouting on Twitter. Second, we should remember that the Stalinist homophobic turn in 1933 was a Soviet, an all-USSR project that changed the law in each of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union. Likewise, the Putin political homophobia project aims to influence the republics of Eurasia in the new geopolitical context of competition between blocs, the EU versus Russia, and its attempt to assemble a Eurasian economic union. Similar gay propaganda laws have been proposed, often by Russian-friendly politicians, in the former republics of the USSR, Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and others. This struggle is not over, and it recasts LGBT repression as a cultural and geopolitical unifier, a form of homophobic nationalism. As well, Putin has elevated the conservative traditional values agenda to the international arena in an attempt to win friends and influence in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and the United Nations. Finally, last bit. The new Putin homophobic project differs from previous Soviet and Russian homophobic policies in being enacted in a globalized digital environment. When Stalin banned sodomy, he got one closely argued 16-page letter from a single Scottish communist. Stalin sent it straight to the archives and it remained there until 1993. Reactions today are far more visible, instantaneous, and volatile. And they will come from voices with little understanding of the local context, on social media especially. We need more careful argument, more historical self-awareness, and more humility in our criticism of Russian homophobia than we have shown so far. Thank you very much.